On my right, we have the CG5 Go-To mount. It's the first telescope mount I ever owned. In fact, I still own it today, as you can clearly see. It got me into astrophotography. It's very reliable. I've loved it ever since. But on my left, we have the CGX mount, and it is a very powerful addition to their current range of telescope mounts. In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing it and highlighting all the key features that make this the perfect telescope mount for your astronomical observations. I'm Damon Scotting, and this is Astronomical. Yeah, so this, as you can probably tell, is quite a beefy mount in its own right. I have owned pretty much all of its predecessors that come before this in terms of Celestron's telescope mount series. The first one I owned was the CG5 Go-To mount. It was extremely capable, and it was basically about as cheap as you could possibly get for a mount that allowed you to auto-guide and track deep sky objects. Yeah, very handy mount, which is why I still have it today. The next step up from that would have been a CGEM mount, but this goes well beyond all of those. We are reaching the level of professional astrophotography when we are dealing with a mount like this. But you may be sat there wondering, what is the difference between this mount and the old CG5 Go-To mount? Because when you boil it down to their most basic functions, they are doing the exact same thing. They're just tracking the night sky. Well, the first thing that will likely be obvious with this mount is that it can take a much higher payload. This can take up to 55 pounds mounted on top of it. You'll also notice a number of different design features as opposed to what the CG5 had. We'll start off by talking about the tripod. So these tightening levers down here, these are actually on the inside of the tripod legs. I think this may be the first time they've ever done that, but this is very beneficial because it stops you catching yourself on it as you're walking past, or potentially getting wires and cables caught on it as you're moving about. So that's a very helpful fix, and it's only a minor one. They've also added markers along each of the tripod legs. The tripod has a much wider stance, which obviously adds to the stability of it. So I do quite a lot of my observations on the grass, which means that whenever you pop the tripod down, it's never perfectly level, it's always slightly uneven, and you have to adjust the tripod legs accordingly. These markers just mean that you can sort of pinpoint more precisely whereabouts each leg is coming out to. And then the tray, which I've always found is a bit of a hindrance, has been modified to make it better suited for putting this entire setup away. So you'll notice around the edges here, we have these sort of indents, or these sort of placeholders that match what you have on the tripod leg itself. Now when I take this apart and I take the actual main mount off, I'm going to want to collapse the tripod down, and this still being in play is always a bit annoying because you have to unscrew this and take this off, which just adds to a lot more time and effort that you didn't really need to put in but are having to. Now, conveniently, you can just rotate it until these points go into each of the tripod legs, and then they'll collapse down nicely. Yeah, I'd say the main thing to note is that there's lots of little quirks about this new setup that are things that are very helpful, but I just had never thought of beforehand. So to see them now introduced on this is very exciting, because they've solved problems that I've always had to deal with but just couldn't think of a better solution to. So yeah, moving on from the tripod, as you can see, we have a much more sturdy and durable mount overall. There are a lot of fine-tuned settings. We can adjust the actual polar alignment much more easier with these knobs at the base here. One of the key points to note with this mount is that all the cables are internal bar one, and that one being the one that you use as a remote controller. So that's the only cable that will be loose and outside of the actual shell of the mount itself, which is very helpful because there's always been the issue of cable snagging, and when your mount's turning around, if certain cables can get caught on one another. I've had it before where I didn't actually tighten in the webcam that I was using in the eyepiece holder, so eventually whilst the telescope was tracking throughout the night, the camera actually got yanked out of the eyepiece holder because one of the cables just got pulled on. Yeah, a lot more organised. So yeah, now we have a side-by-side comparison between the CG5 and the CGX. As you can tell here, there are 3 separate counterweights mounted onto the counterweight bar here for the C10. When I had the C10 on the CGX earlier, all I needed was 2, and that is in part due to the fact that the counterweight bar for this is a lot longer, and therefore, law of moments, the force multiplied by the perpendicular distance from pivot equals the moment. The further we are away from the pivot, then the greater our moment. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because we have a longer counterweight bar, we can put the weight further along the edge. So that is very convenient, the fact that I only need to use 2 counterweights on this setup as opposed to that one. One of the main things that I always have to consider when buying a mount is what a dovetail bracket accepts over here. So with the newer modern ones, they accept the likes of CGE or Losmundi. So that's more modern telescopes themselves. I actually use a C10 Newtonian Celestron telescope, which I managed to get for about $250–300. That has a CG5/Vixen mount on the actual telescope rings. So my initial thought when trying to put it on top of here was, oh god, I'm buggered, you know, I'm gonna have to spend 100 quid now on getting a new dovetail mount. I don't actually have to do that because thanks to this new design, it accepts both of the dovetails. Yeah, you are very likely going to use a much more powerful telescope than I'm using on this particular setup, but the fact that you can use either or is so much more helpful. As you can see on this side and this side, we have two very helpful, handy, sturdy handles, which means you can pick the mount up and move it as you wish. Oh my God, it's also pretty heavy. It's about 30 kilograms, which means it's about 66 pounds in total to lift this up. So it's not lightweight by any measure of the imagination, but at the same time, these help you move it around a lot easier than what you normally have to do, which is pick it up by these freezing cold legs and try not to break your back. Another cool feature is that they've now put in hard stops. So it will reach a certain angle where it just won't go any further. And if you do have an observatory, that's perfect, because you never want the telescope to go beyond a certain point, because otherwise it won't be able to see outside the observatory itself. Or if you just don't like being outside in the cold in general, then this is perfect for you, because on this side over here we have a dedicated PC port, a USB port that can go into your computer. Then you can actually use Celestron's dedicated software in order to control the telescope without necessarily being outside with it. Yeah, we are heading into winter. It is getting much colder. Personally, I'm able to stay outside in these temperatures, but I am wearing about 5 or 6 thermals. Yeah, not great. The fact that all the cables are internal, it just means there's less risk of backlash, and this telescope itself will run a lot smoother than it would beforehand. They're using pulleys instead of motors. Yeah, overall, I'm really impressed by the telescope mount itself. I think it's a very good design. It is, of course, as I've already said, very sturdy, and that brings you a lot of assurance when you're actually doing your observations. Even, for example, securing in the mount head itself, you have to use 3 separate screws that mount in to the tripod itself and then tying it up with an Allen key. It's so much more stable. Right, that's enough talking about its features. I am now going to put my telescope on top of it and start taking some images. Obviously, the images I take with this aren't solely dependent on the mount itself. It's more dependent on the camera and telescope, but the mount will allow you to track these objects very smoothly. So I'd say keep your eye out for the sharpness of the star in these images, because that's the real measure of the telescope mount. Otherwise, this final part of the video is purely just to say, hey, here's some stargazing. Enjoy. Yeah, the telescope mount is available for $2,899 in the US or £2,225 in the UK. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you do want to purchase the telescope mount yourself, make sure you click the link in the description below. Thanks again, Celestron, for sending me this telescope mount. It's been really fun reviewing it. I'm Damon Scotting, and this was Astronomical.